Hey everyone, Warwick's here. We've completed tanks, healers, and melee DPS. Now we're wrapping up this mini-series with the last DPS role, ranged. With Shadowlands just around the corner, I've been doing a look back at BFA and the power of the classes through the retrospective series, and now how much fun I've had with each class in this little mini-series. The general overview is that I played all classes that I didn't have at 120 on a class trial basis, so I could get a full idea of their kits without all the Azerite traits and essences and stuff like that. For those watching this on YouTube, this plus 10 key I ran with pads, where I'm tanking on my Guardian Druid, is here for your enjoyment while you listen to the rest of this. Ranged DPS is the role that I found the hardest to get into this expansion. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that I was a ranged main in my early WoW playing career, as I was a Moonkin main in Burning Crusade and Wrath and early Cataclysm before leaving the game. When I came back in 2018 with BFA, I wanted to change up the role that I played. Thus, I fell into tank and melee DPS specs. I dabbled into healing and I enjoyed it a lot from the few times that I did it. And outside of 2 to 3 specs for ranged, I just struggled to get into the role. For comparison, 4 out of the 6 tanks, 7 out of the 13 melee, and about half the healing roster appealed to me, and I always had fun when I played those top specs in those roles. Ranged was just a little bit harder for me to get into for whatever reason. But let's get diving into the 11 range specs. Number 11 and number 10 fall into the same playstyle, so we're going to group them. At 11 is Affliction Warlock, and at 10 is Shadow Priest. Both specs epitomize the spinning plate style of gameplay where you put up and maintain as many dots as humanly possible. I've never been a big fan of this style of play, although I do it a little bit with my Barrel Druid. Affliction felt like you were just constantly refreshing the dots. You were just rotating through those buttons constantly to maintain them instead of ever feeling like you had a nuke to push that maximized those damage over time effects. It's getting a little bit better with Malefic Rapture, and you have Summoning Dark Glare, which is a big button to press, but outside of that, it just never felt like we were moving anywhere. For Shadow, I just struggled to connect with the class as a whole, and the spec in particular. This probably has to do with the fact that I enjoyed Holy Priest a ton in BFA. So much so that when I was leveling content as Holy, rather than switching to Shadow, BFA's Void Form also felt pretty bad to me, even if you chained multiple Void Forms together. Void Form going to a cooldown in Shadowlands is a huge positive change in my eyes for Shadow. The next 3 specs are going to be ones that I struggled to connect with, but found to be serviceable in some ways. At number 9 is Destruction Warlock. The biggest thing that I found with Destro is that outside of casting Chaos Bolt, the spec was just dull. Building up to Chaos Bolts felt monotonous with no flavor or fun. You just waited until you could fire Chaos Bolt, which is a really fun spell to use. This is what puts it above the dot specs, as previously discussed. Also, Summon Infernal was a fun cooldown that really boosted Destro, but outside of Chaos Bolt, Summon Infernal, the spec just really lacked anywhere else for me for excitement or connection. And number 8 is Arcane Mage. Arcane is a great single target spec that lacked any kind of AoE in a meaningful way. The mana relationship has been a staple of the spec for over a decade. And while it's iconic for the spec, I think it's finally time to shutter that idea. The mana management isn't fun to me anymore, and the arcane charges just feel kind of plastered on top of the spec, when I think they really should be everything that the spec is built around. It's great for boss fights and leveling dungeons, Arcane is, and if you can effectively manage the mana, it did pretty good numbers. Arcane Orb was a fun talent for AoE, and the animations are really good. Arcane Missiles, Arcane Orb, and Arcane Barrage feel impactful when you press them. At number 7 is Fire Mage. Undoubtedly powerful in patches 8.2 and 8.3, Fire Mage just feels incredibly slow without the proper tools of the borrowed power. When you're just on a class trial and getting just a baseline class because you don't really have any of the essences or the corruptions necessary, it feels like a lot of the borrowed power, such as the Blaster Master Azerite trait, Memory of Lucid Dreams Essence, and Masterful Corruptions, just prop up the spec in a way that isn't fun when you don't have those things. That said, Combustion is one of the best cooldowns in the game to use in my view, and it gives the spec a high point that feels impactful every time you use it. Combustion coming off the GCD and automatically placing Rune of Power if you talent that is going to be a fantastic addition to the spec. I think it does well for a GCB issue that has started to appear with Fire, but outside of Combustion and some pretty cool moments with like chaining together hot streaks and stuff like that, just the spec felt really slow if you didn't have the proper borrowed power setups. So So moving on, the next two specs are specs that I actually liked in a lot of different ways, but for me got outshined by other specs of their respective classes, which lowered my desire to play them. At number 6 is Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid was actually the second best Druid spec, in my view, this expansion from a performance standpoint, with Resto being the best performer. I think the way the spec was designed this expansion was one of the best iterations, and finally hit all the notes that I felt it should have been hitting back in Wrath of the Lich King when the Eclipse mechanic was first introduced. It did have some small problems, Starfall being the biggest one, but you felt like you had something to do that was useful in almost any situation. Did you have a spread cleave fight? You could maintain your dots and do respectable damage. Did you need to funnel in on a spec where you had good single target spells and a cooldown that really worked effectively? Did you need a decent set of mob control, mass entanglement into Solar Beam to help control casters, especially when you're paired with a Blood Death Knight that had, say, like Gorfien's Grasp. Do Gorfien's Grasp everything onto one target, use Solar Beam to prevent casting, thus making certain caster heavy pulls maybe really easy. The biggest issue for Balanced Druid for me was that Guardian and Feral Druids were just specs that I liked a lot more than Balance. As much as other specs maybe shouldn't play a role into something like this, when you're doing a personal rankings, I think it matters quite a bit. I can't deny that when I logged in on my Druid, I just wanted to tank, or I wanted to maybe do Cat Druid, just because it felt better for me to feel that way. I was more excited to play those specs than I was maybe going back to my old Moonkin roots from the early days of Warcraft, for me. Balance looks like it's going to be an interesting option in Shadowlands. Hopefully that nerf that they just got is a little bit reverted, because it was pretty hefty. I just can't see myself playing the spec more on an experimental aspect. Maybe for like a video series, like the retrospective series, where I played Balanced Druid in a single dungeon. Cat and Bear Druids are just looking a lot better than they were. Bear Druids is starting to actually generate some buzz as potentially being a mythic raid tank for some world first teams, outside of the normal Brewmaster Blood DK comps that have been talked about ever since the beginning of Alpha. And Cat Druids actually have a lot of interesting tools coming to them, and it looks like they're really going to pump a lot of damage in a pretty positive way, so I'm pretty happy about that. Alright, and the other spec here is Beast Mastery Hunter. Beast Mastery Hunter has no weaknesses. It has great stat scaling with crit, mastery to a smaller extent. It had no casted abilities, so it is fully mobile like a melee character is. It has great defensive tools with Spirit Mend, Exhilaration, and Aspect of the Turtle. A couple of heals and immunity, somewhat. Aspect of the Turtle is weird, but it is an immunity by definition. It has great utility with its pets. You can do tranks, you can do slows, you can do snares, and of course, depending on the type of pet that you had things like damage reduction. If a tenacity pet, you had a Master's Call with cunning pets, which broke CC, limited slows, which can be useful for certain characters as needed, and then of course ferocity pets, which brought bloodlust if you didn't have a mage or a shaman. It just kind of did everything, this expansion. It took a little bit for it to get going, but particularly once corruptions came into play, it became just an absolute monster. The spec rotated around 4 primary buttons: Cobra Shot, Barb Shot, Kill Command, and then Multi-Shot for AoE situations. With cooldowns, Bestial Wrath, and Aspect of the Wild, the spec was kind of limited in things that you had to keep track of. This can be a good thing. If you are someone that is newer to the game, or you just like playing a simpler spec style, Beast Mastery very, very much did that for you. The thing for me though is that once you master the basic of just keeping barb shot charges, kind of rotating them sparsely to maintain frenzy on your pet, that was it. You mastered the spec. Congratulations. There was nothing else to learn. It had no focus management tools because barb shot was a pretty strong focus generator. It had no button interactivity. Okay, Call the Wild with crits resetting barb shot was one thing, but nothing in Bestial Wrath and Kill Command interacting a little bit, but Cobra Shot just kind of was there. You just used it, and it didn't really do much to like help other buttons. It had nothing there. Whereas, you had an Azerite trait from Marksman where aim, shot, reset, rapid fire, making that button ability work a lot better, or the strong core of other specs. It just didn't exist. In short burst, this made Beast Mastery really fun to play. It was way better than I thought when I did my Hunter video, but in long play sessions, I found myself just getting bored with it after 3 or 4 dungeons. play marksmanship for a dungeon or two, then come back to it, and I find it fun again. It's the spec that I couldn't main as a result, but it is one definitely that I could enjoy in burst specs, which is why it's this high. The final 4 specs are ones that I could see myself maining had they been in BFA. At number 4 is Elemental Shaman. Elemental had 2 distinct build paths, which I always love to have. You had the more raid-oriented build around the Ice Fury talent, which highlighted the single target prowess of Ellie, or the Primal Elementalist build with Storm Elemental and controlling the Elemental, which had great AoE. Both builds I found to be fun and engaging for different reasons. The biggest drawback was things like movement-heavy fights. In thinking of Battle for Azeroth dungeons, King Dazar could be movement heavy, Mogul Razdunk was pretty heavy, Ruzan obviously you had to move a lot if you got fixated. There's a few others that required pretty heavy movement. The spec was still a turret-heavy spec, so where you have to plant and cast a lot of your abilities, so in those types of fights it can be really a struggle. However, it wasn't a huge drawback for me. I don't mind that type of carefully planned movement and interaction with your abilities. I like planning movement, like I said, and turret specs I find to be incredibly fun for the most part. It falls this far down into number 4 because it was sometimes very slow with Maelstrom generation in the early levels, which I attribute to kind of low secondary stats, but if we're looking at base classes, this definitely played a part. And with the low stats going into Shadowlands, it's going to be felt again. So I'm worried about what that's going to feel like early in the expansion, and what it's going to do for the community perception of Elemental moving into the next expansion. At number 3, Frost Mage. Frost Mage, the proc-happy spec of Mage. Reactive proc-based specs feel good to play in my eyes. It keeps you on your toes, it kind of forces you to pay attention. Frost Mage does that effectively with the procs Brain Freeze and Fingers of Frost. There's a lot of small interactions, maximizing your Winter's Chill debuff and things like that some will find annoying to micromanage in order to maximize damage on the spec, but I just thought Frost was kind of solid to play all expansion. The micromanaging of it kind of maybe eked out maybe like an extra 100 DPS, so it wasn't a huge factor, but for a spec like Frost that struggled to find viability, particularly late in the expansion with raid teams, even pinching out that last bit of DPS is going to be a huge part to the spec. It never really stood out performance-wise. Mages kind of early on were all kind of and then in 8.1, Arcane gained some buzz, Fire is being played quite a bit, and then in 8.2, 8.3, Fire began to dominate, and Frost never really found a good place. But it has a good sort of core gameplay loop that I find really satisfying to play. And so it just kind of always was there as a spec that I just felt good playing. Yeah, if you got unlucky with your procs, you would just spam Frostbolt, which doesn't hit all that hard for a while, but I didn't find that to be the case a lot of the times, especially once you get decent amount of haste and you get a couple of talents, or you get Azerite traits or anything like that helped with procs of that nature. And then abilities like Glacial Spike, which guarantee a Brain Freeze proc and stuff like that, all felt pretty good. It was good defensively, had strong slows, good mobility with Shimmer, and an immunity, and one of the most powerful immunities, in Ice Block. The spec saw very few changes throughout the expansion. It had that period of time where you ran the No Icelands build, that got hotfixed with the Mastery buff. But other than that, didn't really see much in the way of changes. Blizzard, I think, felt pretty good about how the spec worked. The Borrowed Power didn't really seem to help the spec that much either. Azerite traits didn't necessarily fundamentally change gameplay like Blaster Master did for Fire, and the Essences and the Corruptions didn't necessarily make a huge impact either. You still stacked Masterful, but it just didn't impact it as much as Masterful did for Fire Mage. Or you looked at Expedient, which didn't work as well as necessarily as it did for, say, Arcane Mage. Frost has a long-standing reputation as a PvP spec, and was still undoubtedly powerful in that realm of gameplay. But I hope that it gains more respect as a PvE spec in Shadowlands, even if it's just in, say, one aspect, maybe in Mythic Plus, where it did have some viability early on, but for the most part, it was only because of the massive slows, not necessarily because of the damage that it was doing. However, there's some interesting builds that Frost Mage is potentially looking at with a Frozen Board build that looks to be pretty powerful. Biggest question is going to be the conduits and what are the legendaries going to do for it. Haven't researched Frost Mage that much because I don't plan on playing a mage in Shadowlands, so it's not a thing that I've tried to dig into that much. But I'm hoping that it does something to help sort of their PvE viability, particularly if Fire takes kind of the hit that we all think it's going to take. At number 2, Demonology Warlock. Demolock is one of the more satisfying gameplay loops buffs of any spec in this expansion. Every spell interacted with each other in some way. Shadow Bolt to build shards, Hand of Gul'dan and Call Dreadstalkers to spend them, with Demon Bolt being a surge of shards on a hard-hitting spell when you had your Demonic Core procs. Like Arms Warrior, every button felt impactful to hit in its core rotation. Summon Demonic Tyrant was a cooldown that required some planning, which is a good change from a pace from most specs where you just kind of hit the button on cooldown from the very beginning of the fight. Here you had to build up your army of demons a little bit and then hit the Tyrant, because the more demons you had, the more powerful the Tyrant was. The animations are amazing. The visuals of demonology and all the demons surrounding your character is one of the most awesome visuals in the game. It's definitely not without its problems. It was definitely a secondary stat reliant spec. You need a lot of haste for it to really start to feel extremely good. And it didn't have a stun at all this expansion. That's halfway getting fixed. So that makes it, or I didn't have an interrupt rather. And that's kind of halfway getting fixed. So the spec still definitely has a lot of work that needs to happen. But it just is so satisfying to play. Like I said in the Warlock video, I think some people think that it's maybe not the right style of play. It maybe fits more an action RPG style like Diablo. But I think you can just find the right way. The problem that it had was that in raid situations, mobility is so important in a lot of fights to deal with mechanics. And in Mythic Plus, you're constantly moving and dodging out of mechanics, that Demonology just doesn't find a good place for it. It's kind of the same struggle that Elemental Shaman had, in that in theory it should be really good. It does giga damage when done right, but it just didn't have fight design that was really designed and built for that spec. But I'm hoping that Demonology finds a Covenant, because right now it really doesn't have one, which is kind of an issue. And I'm hoping that some legendaries kind of build out a few styles of play, and I'm hoping that Nether Portal is fixed finally, because I love that ability. It is visually satisfying to hit, and changes up your gameplay in a pretty significant manner that I find pretty fun. So I'm hoping that Nether Portal becomes a talent of choice, and I may dabble in my Demonology Warlock, because I would be a Demonology one trick if I played that spec long term. And finally at number 1, Marksmanship Hunter. Big, beefy aim shot crits, good consistent damage through rapid fire. This spec hit both marks for me. It had a great combination of on-the-move abilities with rapid fire, steady shot, for instance an arcane and multi-shot being able to be used on a move, along with a plant and fire ability and an aim shot. So you had to kind of had to have a good mix of both high mobility and being able to sit down in turret. The flow of the spec was wonky at times, I won't lie, but it wasn't enough to distract from the gameplay style. The petless hunter playstyle really appeals to me. The pet AI in WoW is kind of notoriously horrible, so having a spec that doesn't actually use a pet fulfills a pretty big fantasy for me. I'm also a big fan of sniper playstyles in a lot of shooter style games. I'm playing a Mass Effect playthrough right now with my daughter, where I play a sniper infiltrator. And in a lot of games, even other RPGs like Skyrim for example, I played a sniper bow guy. This was the first character that I ever played before getting into big beefy two-handers or shield wielders. The utility of Marksmanship was lower than Beast Mastery due to the lack of pets, so some of the utility like Trank Shot or decent slow, Concussive Shot was okay but not great. And you didn't really have, of course, the utility of using like Master's Call, Call of the Wild, anything of that nature that allowed you to have that extra bit of utility. By default, you had the damage reduction one as a petless hunter, but being able to have Call of the Wild or Bloodlust on demand would have been really, really nice. But you just didn't get it because you didn't have any pets. Some of that utility is transferring to the hunter player. Trank Shot's the biggest one that comes to my brain. I think that's going to be really, really useful, particularly for mobs that enrage. You saw a few of this in this Underrot run at the beginning. The Blood of the Matrons, they enrage. The dogs in Freehold, they enrage. So those having Trank Shot on those is going to be a good way to help, especially if you don't have a druid in your group for suits, so you become useful in that regard. Much like Arms Warrior, it has a little bit of slower playstyle compared to its DPS equivalent. So I kind of grouped Fury and Arms together, and then we grouped Marksmanship or Fury and Beastmastery together, and then Marksmanship and Arms, where one has kind of a fast and furious playstyle. You're mashing the keyboard a lot, doing a lot of different things with that. That's Fury and Beastmastery. The other spec is a little bit more of a tactical, slow but big hitter type spec when you think of the two-handed warrior, and then of course the slow and steady aim shot, the 2-second cast on that. Really, Marksmanship Hunter just checked all my boxes. Damage that was fun to do, good utility tools that were both niche and some had universal use, a talent build that actually built around the main ability of the spec and aim shot. I think it was a bit underrated compared to its Beast Mastery counterpart, and specs that are undervalued are my jam. I love taking those specs and shining them. Beast Mastery, Windwalker Monk, Feral Druid. I love using those specs. Anyways, that's my final rankings for ranged DPS. How did you rank the ranged specs this expansion? Leave a comment below with your rankings, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It would mean a lot to me. I've enjoyed looking through all the classes in BFA. We'll probably do the same with Shadowlands as time goes on, and the next video is most likely going to be a breakdown of how I'm choosing my main for Shadowlands. That's the decision that everyone's going to need to make. Definitely check out the rest of this mini-series. I'll build a playlist for it after this video is published, and also check out the retrospective series. It won't release until pre-patch on the main video, so I can play with the changes myself before making the decision. Since this Underrot's almost done, I'm going to let this play out. Until then, stay safe, wear your mask, and I will see you next time.